On March 4th, 1797, President John Adams, a Federalist, took the oath of office. A few minutes later, Thomas Jefferson, a Republican, was sworn in as Vice President. A major problem in the constitutional system of choosing a president and vice president had become apparent. Each elector cast 2 votes. The candidate among those who ran for president who received the most electoral votes became president. The candidate who received the second most votes became vice president. It was expected that the electors would choose to vote for a Federalist ticket. In fact, though, many Federalists did not like John Adams at all. A few Southern electors who didn't like Adams thought that they could fix the vote to make Thomas Pinckney, the Federalist vice presidential candidate, president. Some of the New England Federalists found out about the plot and hatched a counterplot to push Adams by not writing in a second choice at all on their ballots. The result of all this engineering was that Adams won by a slim majority and Thomas Jefferson, a Republican, and Adams' political rival, found himself in the vice presidency. So, President John Adams. Adams was a flinty New Englander. He was impressed with his own virtue and personal integrity and expected others to be just as impressed as well. He had very little tact in political and social areas and came off as haughty and aloof. This was not a good pose to strike in an age where popular opinion reigned. Adams' own party was not particularly comfortable with him. He also had a tough act to follow. After all, he succeeded George Washington, whose prestige had grown somewhat when he played Cincinnatus after his second term, gave up the presidency, and moved home to Mount Vernon. Remember, Adams also had a vice president who was the leader of what by 1786 could only be called the opposition party. Adams promptly made things worse by keeping Washington's entire cabinet, all of whom were personally loyal to Alexander Hamilton, and some of whom disliked Adams extremely. The portrait that I've chosen for this page is sort of interesting. There is a very similar portrait, very similarly posed, of George Washington, and that was probably what Adams was looking for. But as you can see from this picture, Adams is definitely not George Washington. By the end of the Washington presidency, the Republicans had gained in popularity over the Federalists. Situations that caused a weakening of the Federalist Party were the Hamiltonian taxes, the National Bank, the Whiskey Rebellion, and the quasi-war with France. During the Adams administration, a series of laws were passed by the Federalist Congress that made Adams and the Federalists even more unpopular. These laws are collectively called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The measures were passed when anti-French feeling was running high in 1789. The Federalists said that these laws were passed to unite the country. It was generally understood by the Federalists that the laws would in fact weaken the Republican Party and any other group who spoke out against the Federalist Party. The laws are called collectively the Alien and Sedition Acts, and I want to briefly talk about each one. First, the Naturalization Act. The Naturalization Act required all aliens to live in the United States for 14 years before they could apply for citizenship. Now, originally, that period of time had only been 7 years, the Naturalization Act. Second, the Alien Act gave the president the authority to expel any aliens that he judged dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States, the Alien Act. The Alien Enemies Act authorized the president in time of war or invasion to banish or imprison any aliens considered a danger to the public security. That's the Alien Enemies Act. And finally, the Sedition Act provided that United States citizens could be fined or imprisoned without trial if they said or printed anything which was, quote, false, scandalous, or malicious against the government, the Congress, the president, or any other federal elected officials. Now, had these laws been strictly enforced, they would have ended all opposition to the Federalist Party. The Naturalization Act went into effect at once and without much opposition. The Alien and Alien Enemies Acts were not strictly enforced, but their very existence was sufficient to drive many French aliens out of the country. 25 Americans were prosecuted under the Sedition Act. All of them were Republicans. Most of them were printers of Republican newspapers. It's important to note that this law was used very selectively. It provided punishment for anyone who maligned any elected official. Jefferson was vice president, but no Federalist newspaper that published scandalous material about Jefferson was ever prosecuted. The Sedition Act clearly interfered with freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Many Americans felt that the acts were unjust and not in keeping with the terms of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Many who had feared that a strong central government would infringe on individual liberty felt that these laws amply justified their fears. The Republicans were furious over the Sedition Act. They voiced their protest through two of their greatest thinkers, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Jefferson prepared the Kentucky Resolution for the Kentucky Assembly, and Madison wrote the Virginia Resolution. These two state laws outlined the idea of states' rights or compact theory of the Constitution. The theory included these ideas. First, the federal government has been created by the states. After all, it was the states that convened conventions to ratify the Constitution. Number two, the federal government was merely an agent for the states, which operated under an agreement, a compact, by which the federal government was delegated its authority by the states. Three, the federal government could be criticized and challenged by the state governments if the federal government began to commit unauthorized acts, place undue limitations on personal liberties, or in some other way violate the Constitution. Finally, in the extreme case, a state might leave the United States, secede if the federal government acted in a manner that was against the interest of the state. Number 4, the states and not the people had voluntarily entered the Union, so the state governments might leave it if the contract between state and federal government were violated by the latter. Now, this is called the compact theory, and we're going to see it pop up again at least a couple of times in the course. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were passed by their respective state legislatures, but to the shock of both Jefferson and Madison, the state legislatures of other states, when asked to pass them, demurred, decided that they would not pass them. The resolutions were important, though. They showed the Federalists that their popularity was beginning to topple. They would also form the basis, as we're going to see much later in the course, for the succession of the southern states in 1860 and 61. The presidential campaign of 1800 was bitterly contested by the Federalists and the Republicans. The campaigning by both sides brought an unprecedented number of Americans to the polls. Adams carried New England, New Jersey, and Delaware. Jefferson carried pretty much everything else. Adams acquired 65 electoral votes, Jefferson 73. But at that point, things get kind of complicated. Since all of the Republican electors had voted for both Jefferson as president and Aaron Burr as vice president, the two were tied for votes. So the election went to the House of Representatives to be settled. Now, since the Federalists connived with Burr to prevent the election from going to Jefferson, things became even more complicated. 36 ballots were required before Jefferson won. The vice presidency went to Burr. Because of the difficulty and political intrigue which went on in the House vote, the 12th Amendment was created that stated that electors had to state separate ballots for president and vice president. Now, interestingly enough, the guy who ultimately gave the vote to Thomas Jefferson was none other than Alexander Hamilton. Burr was from New York, and Hamilton knew Burr and knew that Burr was trouble from the get-go. So Hamilton convinced the New York Federalist delegates on the 36th ballot to vote for Jefferson instead of Burr, which gave Jefferson more votes than Burr and put Jefferson firmly in the presidency. Now, interestingly enough, Burr found out about this and challenged Hamilton to a duel, which they fought on a misty morning across the river from New York in New Jersey, because dueling was illegal in New York. In that duel, Aaron Burr shot and killed Alexander Hamilton. And then Burr ran off. He was the New York legislature voted him to be an outlaw, and Burr was forced to run away out west. And we'll talk a little later about what kind of mess he got himself into. But the story of Adams' presidency isn't really over yet. Jefferson was elected in November of 1800, but would not be sworn into office until March 4th of 1801. Now, in the election of 1800, the House and Senate both turned into Republican majorities. So that meant when Jefferson and the new senators and House members were sworn into office in March, the Federalists would have no real power in terms of elected offices. Federalists realized after the election of 1800 that they were about to lose control of the country. They decided to concentrate federal power in the judiciary before the government turned over to the Republicans in March. During the 4 months between the election and the inauguration of Jefferson, the Federalist Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1801. The act increased the number of judges in the federal system to 16. Adams began appointing Federalists to these positions. The last commissions of appointment that he signed were signed just before midnight on Adams' last day in office, March 3rd. For this reason, all of these judges are called the Midnight Judges. Now, the most significant of Adams' judicial appointments, though he wasn't one of the Midnight Judges, was John Marshall of Virginia, a staunch Federalist who would dominate the Supreme Court as Chief Justice from 1801 to 1835. Next time, we'll take a look at the Jefferson administration.